Laura stood at her front door, the late afternoon sun casting a warm, golden light over the street. Yet her gaze was locked on the sleek black car parked at the end of the road. It had been there for the third evening in a row. There was nothing particularly menacing about the car itself, just an ordinary sedan with tinted windows. But its presence was unsettling. Laura's quiet suburban street was the kind where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors waved as they passed by, where unusual things didn't happen. Except now, something was definitely out of place, and it made her stomach churn with unease. It had started on Monday. Laura had just finished her shift at the bakery and was heading home, tired but content. She enjoyed her work. It was honest, simple, and brought her a sense of peace. After a day spent baking bread and decorating cakes, she'd come home, pour herself a cup of tea, and watch her two children, Jack and Ellie, play in the yard. It was a routine she cherished, a life she had built from the ground up after her husband had left them 2 years ago. Things hadn't been easy, but Laura prided herself on being resilient. She had rebuilt her life around her kids, around her small but close-knit group of friends, and around the quiet predictability of their small town. But now the black car was disturbing that fragile peace. On Monday, she had first noticed it when she turned the corner onto her street. It had been parked in the same spot, idling for a few moments before driving away as she pulled into her driveway. She didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to someone getting lost or waiting for a friend. But the next day, the same car appeared again, parked in the exact same spot, just far enough away to seem inconspicuous, but close enough to make her feel watched. This time, it lingered a little longer, the engine off, the windows dark and unreadable. And now on the third evening, it was back again. Laura leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her mind racing with questions. Should she be worried? Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was someone from out of town visiting a neighbor, but that explanation didn't sit right with her. She had lived on this street for years and knew everyone who came and went. She knew the usual visitors, the delivery trucks, the occasional out-of-town relatives who stopped by for the weekend. But this car, this was different. It didn't belong here. She glanced over her shoulder into the house, where the muffled sounds of her children laughing filled the air. Jack was chasing Ellie around the living room, their voices bouncing off the walls as they played their usual evening game of tag. They had no idea anything was wrong, and Laura wanted to keep it that way. But the thought of them playing so close to the window, in full view of whoever was in that car, made her skin crawl. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and that was a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. Taking a deep breath, Laura stepped outside, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked down the driveway slowly, each step deliberate as if she were testing the ground beneath her. The car didn't move. It just sat there, silent and still. Laura stopped at the edge of her yard, her hands trembling slightly as she debated what to do next. Should she confront them? Should she call the police? What would she even say? There's a car parked on my street, and it's making me uncomfortable. She could imagine the dispatcher's response, the polite but dismissive tone, the suggestion that it was nothing to worry about. But she was worried. Every instinct she had was telling her something wasn't right. The sun had dipped lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the road. A few houses down, Mrs. Parker was watering her garden, oblivious to the strange tension that hung in the air. Laura waved weakly in her direction, but Mrs. Parker didn't notice, her attention focused on her rose bushes. The rest of the street was quiet. Too quiet. Suddenly, the sound of an engine starting snapped Laura's attention back to the car. Her heart skipped a beat as the car's headlights flicked on, piercing through the dusk. For a moment, she thought it was going to drive away, just like it had the past 2 nights. But instead, it remained in place, the engine purring softly, the headlights fixed on the road ahead. It was as if the car was waiting for something or someone. Laura's breath hitched in her throat. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Should she run back inside? Should she stand her ground? Before she could decide, the car began to move, slowly at first, inching forward as if testing her reaction. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet felt glued to the pavement, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The car rolled past her house, its windows still impossibly dark, hiding whoever was inside. As it passed, Laura caught a glimpse of something, a flicker of movement in the back seat. Her heart raced. Was someone watching her? She strained to see more, but it was gone in an instant, the car disappearing around the corner just as quickly as it had come. Laura stood there for what felt like an eternity, her body tense, her breath shallow. When she finally turned and walked back up the driveway, she felt a chill run down her spine. Something about that car, about the way it had been there for 3 nights in a row, wasn't right. And deep down, she knew that whatever was going on, it wasn't over. As she stepped inside, her children's laughter seemed distant, like it belonged to another world. Laura locked the door behind her, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, offering little comfort. She glanced out the window one last time, half expecting to see the car back in its usual spot. But the street was empty, and for the first time that evening, Laura allowed herself to breathe. But the peace was short-lived. That night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that the black car would return. And when it did, she feared it would bring with it a secret she wasn't ready to face. The next morning, Laura tried to push the unsettling thoughts of the black car to the back of her mind as she prepared breakfast for her kids. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, and Jack and Ellie chattered at the table, arguing over who would get the last pancake. Their light-hearted bickering usually made her smile, but today she barely registered it. The memory of the car creeping past her house the night before clung to her like a shadow, darkening her mood. She found herself glancing out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see it parked there again, but the street remained quiet and empty. It wasn't until later that morning, when she was at the bakery, that the weight of the previous evening started to lift. The familiar routine of kneading dough and arranging pastries in the display case helped distract her, and for a few hours, she almost felt like herself again. The warmth of the ovens, the hum of the mixer, and the steady flow of customers gave her a sense of normalcy she desperately needed. But as the morning wore on, the tension in her chest slowly returned. It started when Mrs. Parker came into the bakery, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something more guarded. Laura greeted her with a smile, but Mrs. Parker barely returned it. She lingered by the counter, picking at a tray of muffins, but not really looking at them. "Morning, Mrs. Parker," Laura said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Everything okay?" Mrs. Parker hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door before she leaned in closer. "Have you noticed that car?" Laura's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't told anyone about the black car, hoping it was just her imagination, or that it would go away on its own. But if Mrs. Parker had noticed it too, that meant something more was going on. "I've seen it," Laura replied carefully. "It's been around the past few nights." Mrs. Parker's frown deepened. "It's been here during the day too. I saw it yesterday, parked at the end of the street for almost an hour. And then again this morning, just sitting there." Laura's stomach twisted. "Do you know whose car it is?" Mrs. Parker shook her head. "That's the thing. No one seems to know. I asked Mr. Jenkins if he recognized it, but he didn't. Said it wasn't anyone from around here." A cold knot of dread formed in Laura's chest. The fact that someone else had seen the car, and that it had been there during the day, not just at night, made everything feel more real, more dangerous. She forced a smile, trying to hide her growing anxiety. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, more to convince herself than Mrs. Parker. But Mrs. Parker wasn't convinced. "I don't know, Laura. It's strange, don't you think? Why would someone park outside your house for hours and not make themselves known? It's unsettling." Laura nodded, her mind racing. It was unsettling. And the longer the car stayed around, the more questions it raised. Was someone watching her? If so, why? She hadn't done anything to draw attention to herself. She lived a quiet life, kept to herself, and focused on her kids and her job. There was no reason for anyone to be spying on her. At least, none that she could think of. For the rest of the day, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that the black car was more than just a coincidence. Every time she looked out the bakery window, she half expected to see it parked across the street, but it never appeared. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, gnawing at the back of her mind. When her shift ended, Laura was exhausted, both physically and mentally. As she drove home, her eyes kept flicking to her rearview mirror, scanning the road for any sign of the black car. But the streets were empty, just as they had been that morning. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, hoping that maybe the car was gone for good. But her hope was short-lived. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Parked at the far end of the street, just barely visible through the trees, was the black car. Her heart sank. It was back. Laura parked her car and sat there for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She felt a surge of frustration rise in her chest. This wasn't fair. She had done nothing to deserve this. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant feeling of being watched. Whoever was in that car had no right to invade her life like this. Without thinking, she got out of the car and marched toward the street, her eyes fixed on the black sedan. Her heart was pounding, but she didn't care. She had had enough. She wasn't going to let this mysterious stranger scare her anymore. If they wanted to sit outside her house, fine. But she was going to find out who they were and why they were here. As she approached the car, she could feel her pulse quicken. The windows were still tinted, just as they had been before, making it impossible to see who was inside. She stopped a few feet away from the driver's side door, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. For a moment, she stood there, waiting for something to happen. But the car remained silent, the engine off, the windows dark. Summoning her courage, Laura knocked on the window. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Can I help you?" There was no response. She knocked again, louder this time. "I know you've been watching my house. I want to know why." Still, nothing. The car remained as still as a tomb. Laura felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to back down. She knocked a third time, harder, her hand trembling. "Who are you?" For a long moment, the silence stretched between her and the car, thick and suffocating. And then, just when Laura thought the driver was going to ignore her again, the window slowly rolled down. Her breath caught in her throat as the window lowered, revealing a middle-aged woman with graying hair and piercing blue eyes. The woman stared at Laura for a moment, her expression unreadable, before speaking in a calm, measured voice. "You don't know me," the woman said softly, "but I know you, and I need to tell you something about your father." Laura blinked, her mind reeling. Her father? What could this woman possibly know about her father? He had been gone for years, and they hadn't spoken since his sudden disappearance from her life. Why would a stranger be here now, talking about him? The woman didn't wait for Laura to respond. She reached into the passenger seat and picked up a manila envelope, handing it through the window. "Read this. It will explain everything." Laura stared at the envelope, her hand frozen in midair, unsure whether to take it. Her mind was spinning with questions, but before she could ask any of them, the woman rolled up the window, started the car, and drove away without another word. Laura stood there in the middle of the street, clutching the envelope in her trembling hand as the black car disappeared around the corner. Her heart was racing, and her mind was flooded with 100 different thoughts, but one question rose above them all. What could this stranger possibly know about her father that she didn't? Laura stood frozen in the middle of the street long after the black car had disappeared from sight. The envelope in her hand felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just paper, but the weight of something she wasn't prepared for. Her mind was a tangled mess of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The woman's words echoed in her head, refusing to settle. I need to tell you something about your father. The last time Laura had thought about her father, it was with a sharp pang of anger and loss. He had left without a word when she was just a teenager, vanishing from her life, and leaving behind a string of unanswered questions and unresolved pain. As she stood there, gripping the envelope tightly, memories of her father began to resurface. She remembered him as a distant figure, always distracted, always on the move, with secrets he never shared. He had been a man who lived on the edge, involved in things she never quite understood. Growing up, she had learned not to ask questions, but even as a young girl, she could sense there was more to him than he let on. And then, one day, he was gone. No note, no explanation, just an empty space where he used to be. Her mother had fallen apart in the years that followed, and Laura had been forced to grow up faster than she should have, taking on the responsibility of caring for her mother and trying to keep their fragile family together. Now, standing in the street with that envelope, it felt like her father's ghost had returned, dragging with it the dark secrets she had tried to bury. The idea that this stranger, the woman in the car, knew something about him, something Laura didn't, sent a chill down her spine. What could possibly be in this envelope that could explain years of silence? What secret had he taken with him when he left? The world around her seemed a blur as she walked back toward her house, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She opened the door, stepping inside, the familiar warmth of her home offering little comfort. Her children were still in the living room, Jack engrossed in a video game while Ellie was coloring at the coffee table, both oblivious to the storm that was brewing in their mother's mind. Laura moved like a sleepwalker, heading into the kitchen and sitting down at the table. She placed the envelope in front of her and stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought about just throwing it away, pretending the strange encounter had never happened, but she knew she couldn't. Whatever was inside that envelope, it had followed her for years, haunting the corners of her life. She couldn't run from it anymore. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. The paper was yellowed and worn, as if it had been written a long time ago and kept hidden all this time. The handwriting was familiar. It was her father's. Her breath caught in her throat as she began to read. Laura, if you're reading this, it means you've been found. I know I disappeared without a word, and I can never take back the pain I caused you and your mother. But there are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you then because it would have put you in danger. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me, but I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't. There's something you need to know about our family, about the life I lived before you were born. I wasn't just your father, Laura. I was someone else entirely, a man with secrets, debts, and enemies. I tried to leave that life behind when I met your mother, but the past has a way of catching up to you. It caught up to me, and I had to leave to protect you. But even after all these years, it seems those enemies haven't forgotten. The woman who gave you this letter, her name is Eleanor. She was part of my life before I met your mother, and she's been protecting a secret for me, one that involves you. You're the key to something I couldn't finish. There's an inheritance waiting for you, but it comes with risks. You'll need Eleanor's help to claim it, but be careful. Not everyone who knows about this is on your side. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed me, but I hope this letter explains why. I did what I thought was best, even if it meant leaving you behind. You're stronger than you know, and I have no doubt you'll make the right choice, whatever that may be. Your father. Laura stared at the letter, her mind spinning with disbelief. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her, like she was falling into a dark, bottomless pit of secrets she had never wanted to uncover. Her father had been living a double life, and she had been completely oblivious. All those years of wondering why he had left, of blaming herself for thinking she wasn't good enough. And now she knew the truth. He hadn't left because of her. He had left because of something far more dangerous. Something that was still out there, waiting for her. The name Eleanor echoed in her mind. The woman from the car. She had been part of her father's hidden world, a world Laura had never even known existed. And now this stranger was back in her life, holding the key to a mysterious inheritance that Laura had never heard of. What kind of inheritance came with risks? And why did her father think she needed Eleanor's help to claim it? None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Whatever her father had been involved in, it hadn't died with him. Laura felt a wave of anger surge through her. How could her father have left her with this mess? How could he have abandoned her and her mother, only to drag her back into his dangerous world all these years later? She had built a life for herself, carved out a small piece of peace and stability. And now it was being ripped away from her. All because of secrets she had never asked to be a part of. But as the anger subsided, it was replaced by something else, a cold, creeping fear. If her father had enemies, if there were people out there who still wanted something from her, then her children could be in danger too. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't let Jack and Ellie get caught up in this. Whatever her father had left behind, whatever risks this inheritance carried, she had to protect them at all costs. Laura sat there for a long time, the letter spread out in front of her, her mind racing with possibilities. What should she do? She could try to ignore it, pretend it didn't matter, but deep down she knew that wasn't an option. The black car, the mysterious woman, the letter, it was all too real. And if her father's enemies were still out there, ignoring it would only put her family in more danger. She had no choice. She had to confront this head-on, even if it meant stepping into the darkness her father had left behind. That evening, after her children were asleep, Laura sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, her phone in her hand, debating whether to call Eleanor. The number was written on the back of the letter in her father's familiar scrawl. It felt surreal, like she was on the verge of stepping into another life, one that she had never imagined for herself. But she couldn't ignore the reality in front of her. The mysterious inheritance, the threats, the secrets. This was her life now, whether she liked it or not. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. Eleanor answered on the second ring. "I knew you'd call," she said, her voice calm, almost expectant. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Eleanor spoke again. "Then meet me tomorrow. I'll explain everything. But be careful, Laura. This isn't just about you anymore. Others are watching." The line went dead, leaving Laura in the silent kitchen, her heart racing, her mind filled with dread. The next morning arrived far too quickly, the night having offered Laura little rest. She had tossed and turned, haunted by the revelation of her father's double life, and the growing weight of the mystery that now threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. It wasn't just about her anymore. This involved her children, her life, and possibly the safety of the people she cared about. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes, but how was she supposed to make sense of this tangled mess of secrets? As the sun filtered through the kitchen window, she found herself sitting at the table once again, staring at the now familiar envelope and the number she had dialed the night before. Eleanor had told her to meet, but the warning had been clear. Others are watching. Who were these others? What did they want from her? What had her father been involved in that would lead to such dangerous consequences? She had no answers, only a growing sense of dread. After dropping Jack and Ellie off at school, Laura made her way to the address Eleanor had given her. It was on the outskirts of town, in a place she hadn't been before, a secluded cafe tucked away on a road that seemed almost forgotten. The drive was long and filled with anxious thoughts, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. When she arrived at the cafe, the parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few scattered cars, one of which was the now all too familiar black sedan. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it. Eleanor was already there, waiting for her. Taking a deep breath, Laura stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, her legs feeling heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Inside, the cafe was dimly lit and quiet, the soft murmur of the radio playing in the background. At a booth in the corner, Eleanor sat alone, stirring a cup of coffee. She looked up as Laura approached, her expression calm, almost serene, as if they were meeting for a casual chat. But Laura knew better. Nothing about this was casual. "You came," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. Laura sat down across from her, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" she replied, her voice edged with the frustration and fear she had been holding in. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving Laura's face. "I know this must be overwhelming for you," she said finally. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions." "That's an understatement," Laura muttered, glancing around the cafe to make sure no one was listening. It was mostly empty, except for a waitress wiping down a counter in the distance. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Eleanor set her cup down and leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to scare you, Laura. I'm here to help you understand what's at stake." Laura's frustration boiled over. "Help me? How exactly is following me around in a black car and delivering cryptic letters from my dead father supposed to help me? You've done nothing but make me feel like I'm losing my mind." Eleanor sighed, her expression softening. "I'm sorry for the way this has unfolded, but there are reasons for the secrecy. Your father was involved in something much bigger than either of us realized, and when he left, he did so to protect you." Laura leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "You keep saying that. To protect me, but from what? What was he involved in?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing down at her coffee before looking back at Laura. "Your father, he wasn't just a businessman, as you were led to believe. He had ties to a network of people who deal in very dangerous things: smuggling, high-stakes investments, off-the-record dealings with people in powerful positions. He tried to leave that life behind when he met your mother, but they wouldn't let him go. When they realized he had a family, he had to make a choice: stay and risk all of you being dragged into it, or disappear." Laura felt a cold chill run down her spine. "So he chose to abandon us." Eleanor shook her head. "He didn't abandon you. He was trying to protect you. But even after all these years, the people he left behind never forgot. They've been watching, waiting, and now they believe that you know something, that you have access to something valuable." Laura frowned, confusion knitting her brows. What could I possibly have that they want? Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out another envelope, smaller than the one before. She slid it across the table toward Laura. "This is the key to the inheritance your father left behind. It's not just money, Laura. It's something far more valuable." Hesitantly, Laura took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single key and a small slip of paper with an address written on it. The address wasn't far from the town, but it was a place Laura didn't recognize. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The inheritance," Eleanor said quietly. "Your father hid something there, something that people have been trying to get their hands on for years. He entrusted it to you, believing that when the time was right, you'd be able to protect it." Laura's hands shook as she held the key. "Why me? Why would he leave something so dangerous to me?" "Because he knew you were strong enough to handle it," Eleanor replied. "He trusted you, Laura. He believed you had the strength to face whatever comes next." Laura felt her heart pounding in her chest, her mind spinning with the enormity of what Eleanor was telling her. This was too much. She wasn't prepared for this. She was just a single mother trying to get by, trying to raise her kids and live a quiet life. She wasn't some guardian of a dangerous secret, and she certainly wasn't equipped to deal with whatever threats were out there. "I can't do this," she said, shaking her head. "I don't want any part of this." Eleanor reached across the table and placed a hand on Laura's, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know it's overwhelming, but you don't have a choice anymore. The moment your father disappeared, they began watching. And now that they know you have the key, they'll stop at nothing to get it." Laura felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. What do they want? What is it that my father left behind? Eleanor's face grew somber. "It's information, Laura. Information that could ruin powerful people. Your father was involved in some very high-stakes dealings, and he kept records of everything. If those records were to be made public, it could destroy lives, reputations, entire companies. That's what they're after. And now it's your responsibility to protect it." Laura stared at Eleanor, her mind spinning. This was too much. She wasn't some kind of hero. She didn't want to be caught in the middle of a dangerous game involving people she didn't even know. But as much as she wanted to walk away, to pretend this wasn't happening, she knew she couldn't. If her father had truly left this responsibility to her, then she had to see it through. For her sake, for her children's sake. "What do I do now?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's gaze hardened. "You follow the address. You find what your father left behind, and you protect it with everything you have. Because if you don't, the people who are watching won't just stop at threats. They'll come for you, and for your family." A wave of dread washed over Laura. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. If she didn't figure out a way to protect whatever her father had left, her family could be in danger, and she wasn't going to let that happen. No matter what it took, she would protect her children from the darkness her father had left behind. As Laura left the cafe, the weight of the key in her pocket felt heavier with every step. This was only the beginning, and she had no idea what was waiting for her at that address. But one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. As Laura drove toward the address written on the slip of paper, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind buzzing with the weight of everything Eleanor had told her. The morning had already been overwhelming, and now she was speeding toward an unknown destination, carrying a key to a mystery that seemed more dangerous by the minute. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black car following her again, or maybe something worse. But the road behind her was empty, just as it had been for miles. The address took her outside the town limits, down a winding country road that led to an area she had never visited before. It wasn't long before the familiar streets and houses gave way to dense woods, the road narrowing as it curved deeper into the wilderness. Laura's pulse quickened as the trees closed in on either side of her car, casting long shadows across the pavement. She felt a growing sense of isolation, as though she was leaving the world she knew behind, heading into something darker, something far more dangerous. The address led her to a small, unmarked driveway nearly hidden by overgrown bushes. Laura almost missed it, but a flash of recognition from the slip of paper made her stop and reverse. The driveway was long and rough, cutting through the dense woods like a forgotten path. Laura swallowed her fear and turned down the driveway, the crunch of gravel beneath her tires the only sound in the eerie quiet of the forest. At the end of the driveway stood a small weathered cabin, its wooden exterior bleached gray from years of exposure to the elements. The place looked abandoned, with tall weeds growing around the perimeter and the windows darkened by dust and grime. A cold shiver ran down Laura's spine as she parked the car and stepped out. The silence was oppressive, the thick air clinging to her skin. This was it, the place her father had left for her, the place where the secrets he had taken with him might finally be revealed. The key felt heavy in her pocket as she approached the cabin, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had no idea what to expect. What could her father have hidden here in the middle of nowhere? Why had he gone to such lengths to keep it a secret? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Reaching the front door, Laura hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She glanced around, half expecting someone to appear out of the trees, watching her every move. But the woods remained still and silent. Steeling herself, she pulled the key from her pocket, slid it into the rusted lock, and turned it. The door creaked open with a groan, the air inside heavy with the smell of dust and decay. The interior of the cabin was sparse, with little more than a few pieces of old broken furniture and bare wooden walls. It was clear no one had lived here for years. A layer of dust coated everything, and the windows, thick with grime, let in only slivers of light. Laura stepped inside, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty space. The air was thick, oppressive, and she felt a growing sense of dread as she walked deeper into the cabin. At first glance, there didn't seem to be anything unusual about the place. Just an old forgotten cabin in the middle of nowhere. But Laura knew there had to be more. There had to be something her father had hidden here, something worth all the secrecy and danger. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of a clue, any hidden compartment or out-of-place object. Then she saw it, a small dusty rug in the center of the floor, slightly askew. Something about it caught her attention, a strange feeling that there was more beneath it. Laura knelt down and pulled the rug aside, revealing a trapdoor embedded in the wooden floor. Her heart skipped a beat. This was it. Whatever her father had left for her, it was down there. With trembling hands, Laura grabbed the metal ring on the trapdoor and heaved it open. A set of narrow wooden stairs descended into the darkness below. The smell of damp earth and mildew wafted up from the basement, filling her nostrils with the scent of rot. She hesitated for a moment, her mind screaming at her to turn back, to leave this place and forget everything. But she couldn't. Not now. She had come too far to back out. Grabbing the flashlight she had brought with her, Laura started down the stairs, each creaking step sending a jolt of anxiety through her. The basement was dark and cold, the air thick and musty. Her flashlight beam flickered across the stone walls as she reached the bottom, revealing a small windowless room with shelves lining the walls. The shelves were stacked with old boxes, papers, and what looked like filing cabinets, things that didn't belong in an abandoned cabin in the woods. Laura's hands trembled as she moved toward the nearest shelf, her flashlight illuminating the dust-covered boxes. She pulled one down and opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she saw what was inside. Stacks of old documents, photographs, and folders, marked with strange symbols and names she didn't recognize. Her father's handwriting covered many of the papers, notes scrawled in the margins, dates circled in red ink. It was a treasure trove of information, and from what little she could decipher, it wasn't good. Her father had kept detailed records, names, dates, transactions, all tied to powerful people, the kind of people who operated in the shadows, just as Eleanor had warned her. This was the inheritance her father had left for her. Evidence, blackmail, information that could ruin lives and topple empires. Laura's heart pounded as the reality of it all sank in. This wasn't just about her father's past. This was about something much bigger, something far more dangerous. As she sifted through the papers, she came across a thick folder labeled with her father's name. Inside were letters, photographs of him with men she didn't recognize, and detailed records of the deals he had been involved in. But there was something else, too, something that made her blood run cold. A photograph of her, taken only a few weeks ago, standing outside her house with her children. There was a note attached, "Keep an eye on her." Laura's stomach churned with fear. Whoever had been watching her, whoever had sent that black car, they knew where she lived. They had been following her, tracking her every move. And now they knew that she had the key to her father's secrets. Her hands shook as she stuffed the documents back into the box, her mind racing. She had to get out of here. She had to take the evidence and leave before it was too late. But just as she turned to head back up the stairs, she heard it. The sound of footsteps above her, slow and deliberate, echoing through the cabin. Laura froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Someone was here. Panic surged through her as the footsteps grew closer, moving toward the trapdoor. She quickly turned off her flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness, and crouched down behind one of the shelves, trying to steady her breathing. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears as the trapdoor creaked open above her. A shaft of light pierced the darkness, and she saw the shadow of a figure descending the stairs. Whoever it was, they had found her. They knew she was here. Laura's mind raced, her heart pounding with fear. She had no idea who was coming down those stairs, but she knew one thing. They weren't here to help her. She had to make a choice, and fast. If she stayed hidden, they would find her. If she ran, they might catch her. But she couldn't let them take her, or the evidence her father had left behind. With a burst of adrenaline, Laura grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal pipe that had been lying on the floor, and positioned herself in the shadows, waiting for the figure to descend fully into the basement. She could hear their slow, measured breathing, the sound of their boots scraping against the wooden steps. Her hands tightened around the pipe, her body trembling with fear, but fueled by the instinct to survive. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs, their flashlight beams sweeping across the room. Laura held her breath, staying perfectly still, hidden behind the shelves. The light passed over her for a brief second, and then moved away, focusing on the boxes and papers she had been sifting through moments before. This was her chance. With all the strength she could muster, Laura lunged from the shadows, swinging the pipe with everything she had. It connected with the figure's shoulder with a sickening thud, and they stumbled back, their flashlight clattering to the floor. Laura didn't wait to see who it was. She bolted for the stairs, her heart racing as she scrambled upward, her feet slipping on the wooden steps. She could hear the figure groaning behind her, struggling to get back up. But Laura didn't stop. She burst through the trapdoor and into the cabin, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She grabbed the box of documents from the floor and sprinted out of the cabin, her mind screaming at her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. As she reached her car and threw the box into the backseat, she glanced over her shoulder. expecting to see the figure from the basement chasing after her. But the cabin remained still, the door closed, no sign of movement. With shaking hands, Laura started the engine and sped down the driveway, her heart pounding in her chest. She had escaped, but she knew this wasn't over. Laura's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel, speeding down the narrow, gravel-covered road that led away from the cabin. Her mind was a blur of panic and adrenaline, the events of the last few hours replaying over and over in her head. The box of documents sat on the passenger seat, a stark reminder of the danger that still loomed over her and her family. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone tailing her, but the road remained empty. The isolation of the woods, once comforting in its quiet, now felt oppressive, like the trees themselves were closing in on her. The figure in the basement, who were they? Were they one of her father's enemies, or was it someone else entirely? All she knew for certain was that whoever it was had been looking for the same thing she had. The secrets her father had hidden away, the damning information that could bring powerful people to their knees. And now that she had it, they would stop at nothing to get it from her. As the trees thinned and she neared the main road, Laura allowed herself to breathe, but only slightly. She still didn't know who was after her or how much time she had before they caught up. She needed to get somewhere safe, but where? Her house was the first place they'd look, and she couldn't risk going back to town and putting her children in danger. Jack and Ellie were the most important thing in her life, and if anything happened to them because of her father's legacy, she'd never forgive herself. She drove aimlessly for a while, her thoughts swirling. She needed help. Eleanor had warned her about the risks, but maybe she could also provide a solution. Laura grabbed her phone and, with one hand still on the wheel, scrolled to Eleanor's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a moment before she pressed it. It rang once, twice, 3 times before Eleanor answered. "Laura," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Where are you?" "I found the documents," Laura said, her voice shaking. "But someone was at the cabin. I barely got out." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Eleanor's tone shifted, colder, more focused. "You need to get somewhere safe. Don't go home. They'll be expecting you there." "I know," Laura said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "But I don't know where to go. They know everything about me. I found a photo of me and my kids. They've been watching us." Eleanor sighed softly. "I was afraid of that. These people, once they've set their sights on something, they don't let go easily. But you're not alone in this. I'll meet you." "Where?" Laura asked, her mind racing. She needed a plan, something solid that could protect her family and keep her out of the reach of these dangerous people. But she didn't trust anyone, not even Eleanor, completely. Was Eleanor really on her side? Or was she just another player in a game Laura didn't fully understand? "There's a safe house about an hour from here," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "I'll send you the address. You need to go there now. It's secure, and I can explain everything in person. But you have to move quickly. We don't have much time." Laura hesitated. She didn't have many options, but the idea of trusting Eleanor, who was still a stranger to her in so many ways, was unsettling. But she couldn't stay on the run forever, and the documents in the box were too dangerous to handle on her own. If Eleanor was right, then this safe house might be her only chance at protecting herself and her kids. "Okay," Laura said finally. "Send me the address." A moment later, her phone buzzed with a message, and an address appeared on the screen. It was even further out into the countryside, isolated from any major roads or towns. She didn't like the idea of going deeper into hiding, but right now it seemed like the best option. She hung up and sped toward the new destination, her mind still racing with questions. What was in these documents that made them so valuable, so dangerous? Who had been watching her all this time? And what had her father done to make so many enemies? As the miles passed, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was driving further into the unknown, into a labyrinth of secrets that she might never fully escape from. But she had no choice. She had to see this through, for her sake and for her children. When she finally arrived at the safe house, it was nearly dusk. The house was small and nondescript, tucked away at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by thick trees. It looked abandoned, but Laura knew better. If Eleanor had sent her here, it was because this place was secure, hidden from the prying eyes of the people hunting her. She parked her car behind the house, out of sight, and grabbed the box of documents. As she approached the front door, she noticed a faint light glowing from within. Eleanor was already inside. Laura hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She was about to step even deeper into this world of secrets and lies, a world she had never asked to be a part of. But there was no turning back now. She opened the door and stepped inside. The house was sparsely furnished, with only the bare essentials: a table, a few chairs, a couch, and a single lamp casting a dim glow over the room. Eleanor stood by the window, her face expressionless as she turned to greet Laura. "You made it," she said, her voice calm, as if they weren't in the middle of a life-threatening situation. Laura dropped the box on the table, her nerves on edge. "What is all of this?" she demanded. "Why did my father leave this to me? Why is this happening?" Eleanor walked over to the table and opened the box, sifting through the papers and documents as she spoke. "Your father was part of something much bigger than you ever knew. He worked with people in powerful places, people who thought they were untouchable. But your father, he was smart. He kept records of everything, every deal, every conversation, every illegal transaction. And he knew that one day, those records would be his only leverage." "Leverage for what?" Laura asked, her voice filled with frustration and fear. Why didn't he just destroy it all? "Because that information was his insurance policy," Eleanor said, her eyes darkening. "Without it, those people would have killed him a long time ago. But with it, he had power over them. As long as the documents existed, they couldn't touch him. But when he disappeared, they started searching. And now they know you have the key to all of it." Laura sank into a chair, the weight of everything crushing her. "What am I supposed to do with it? I'm not my father. I don't want anything to do with these people." Eleanor sat down across from her, her gaze steady. "You have a choice, Laura. You can run, try to disappear like your father did. But they'll keep hunting you, and eventually they'll find you. Or you can use the documents, the information, to take them down. You can expose them for what they are, but it won't be easy, and it won't be safe." Laura felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had never asked for this. She didn't want to be a part of this world, this web of deceit and danger, but she also couldn't run forever. And she couldn't let these people continue to control her life, to threaten her and her children. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Eleanor nodded, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "First, we need to make copies of everything. Then we'll send it to the right people, journalists, lawyers, anyone who can help expose the truth. But you need to be prepared. Once this goes public, there will be no turning back." Laura swallowed hard, fear and determination swirling inside her. She had never wanted to be a part of this, but now that she was, she had no choice but to see it through. She had to protect her children, and if that meant taking down the people who had been chasing her father all these years, then so be it. As Eleanor began organizing the documents, Laura felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She was terrified, yes, but for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt like she had control over her own fate. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting back. The night grew darker, and the safe house remained quiet, hidden away from the world. But Laura knew that this was only the beginning. The people who had been watching her, who had been hunting her father's secrets, wouldn't stop. But she wouldn't stop either. She had a new purpose now, a new fight. And no matter what it took, she would protect her family and make sure the truth came out. As she looked at the pile of documents on the table, a single thought echoed in her mind. It's time to end this. The next morning would bring a new battle, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready.